In recent months, Britain's economic outlook has grown increasingly fragile, with borrowing costs surging, growth stagnating, and debt levels climbing to historic highs. For many economists, this feels eerily familiar. A situation that echoes the financial crisis of the 1970s, when Britain was forced to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for a bailout. Now, some of the nation's leading voices in economics are warning that history could be about to repeat itself. One of the most alarming voices comes from Professor Jagjit Chadha, who recently stepped down as director of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. Professor Jagjit Chadha is no alarmist. His words carry the weight of decades spent studying Britain's fiscal and monetary health. Yet, his recent comments struck a chord of deep concern. He claimed that the economy was at risk of collapse. He said the financial situation was as perilous as the period leading up to the IMF loan of 1976, when Britain had to be bailed out by the global banking body. He stated, "I'm in a world in which I could imagine it, an IMF bailout, happening, and will be bereft in that case. We will not be able to roll over debt. We will not be able to meet pension payments. Benefits will be hard to pay out." When someone as respected as Professor Chadha issues a warning like this, it's not just a small concern. It's a major alarm. He's describing a situation where the UK government could lose the trust of global investors. If that happens, Britain might struggle to borrow money or refinance its debt without offering extremely high interest rates. The consequences could be severe. Pension payments might be delayed, benefits could be disrupted, and essential public services could run short of funds. In Chadha's view, the foundations of Britain's finances are already starting to weaken. The Telegraph article that carried Chadha's warning paints a bleak picture of the economy under Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Her approach, one of aggressive spending and taxation to plug a widening budget deficit, has been labelled by some as a high-stakes gamble. Economists quoted in the article argue that Reeves' strategy risks recreating the toxic combination of high borrowing and high inflation that plagued Britain in the 1970s. Rachel Reeves' tax and spend gamble is driving Britain towards a 1970s-style debt crisis and bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the article states. The suggestion is that unless there is a dramatic course correction, the UK could be sleepwalking into a fiscal trap from which it cannot easily escape. Andrew Sentance, a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, is among those who share this concern. Rachel Reeves is on course to deliver a Healey 1976-style crisis in late 2025 or 2026. Like Healey, she has massively boosted public spending, borrowing, and taxes, fueling both demand pull and cost push inflation. Unless policies are reversed, we are heading for an economic crash. Before taking Andrew Sentence's warning at face value, it's worth pausing to ask an important question. Has Rachel Reeves really increased public spending, borrowing, and taxes as dramatically as he claims? When it comes to public spending, Rachel Reeves' 2024 budget marked a major expansion. As reported, in all, the budget, the first delivered by a female chancellor, raised spending by £70 billion a year over the next 5 years, with about half the increase paid for by tax increases and the remainder from additional borrowing. When it comes to public borrowing, Rachel Reeves has overseen a sharp rise. In September, UK government borrowing hit the highest level for the month in 5 years. Borrowing over the first 6 months of the financial year has now reached £99.8 billion, which the ONS said external was the second highest total for that period since monthly records began in 1993, after that of 2020. It is also £7.2 billion more than the amount the OBR had predicted. When it comes to taxation, in her October 2024 budget, Reeves had introduced £40 billion in tax increases, the largest since 1993. However, at the time she pledged there would be no additional tax rises beyond those already announced. So yes, the statement is substantially true. Rachel Reeves has increased public spending, especially for 2024-2025, raised taxes by a large amount, and allowed higher borrowing by changing rules and launching new investment programmes. The parallels between the UK in 2025 and 1976 are striking. In 1976, soaring inflation, a collapsing pound, and spiralling borrowing costs brought the economy to its knees. Britain had to borrow $3.9 billion from the IMF, at that time the largest loan in the fund's history. In exchange, the government was required to implement severe spending cuts, dismantle part of its welfare programmes, and scale back public investment. The humiliation was immense. Now, as Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio reaches 96.3%, the fifth highest in the developed world, the warning lights are flashing. This is a post-war high, significantly higher than before the 2008 financial crisis, which immediately signals that the trend is moving in the wrong direction. Some economists fear the country may be edging toward a similar reckoning. Charder's warning is not isolated. Willem Buiter, another former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, said that unless Miss Reeves changed course, she would face scrutiny from the markets that will be at least as effective as the pressure from the IMF was in the 1970s. He said the Chancellor will be forced to break Labour's manifesto and raise taxes on the working people in the autumn to calm the bond markets. I think there's no realistic alternative to basically breaking the commitment not to raise key taxes, personal income tax, VAT, during this government's term in office. So she will be forced to do that, he added. His point is that even if a formal IMF bailout never materialises, the bond markets themselves, through rising yields and collapsing investor confidence, could impose the same kind of discipline. Britain could find itself effectively dictated to, not by the IMF, but by financial markets. It's important to note that some economists believe direct comparisons to the 1976 IMF bailout are overstated. You can quote me as saying that is complete nonsense. Something like that is just hysteria, said Michael Saunders, a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. That is not to say the UK does not have a weak fiscal position. It does, but it is somewhere well between that and an IMF bailout. The disagreement over Britain's economic outlook ultimately reflects differing interpretations of how much strain the country's finances can bear before the system breaks. Those sounding the alarm, like Professor Jagjit Charder and Andrew Sentence, argue that history is repeating itself in slow motion. They point to rising interest payments, now consuming roughly 1 in every £10 of public spending, and a debt-to-GDP ratio nearing 96%, levels unseen since the aftermath of the Second World War. In their view, these are not abstract numbers, but flashing red warnings that Britain's fiscal credibility is eroding. Once markets begin to lose faith, they warn, the decline can accelerate rapidly, forcing the government into painful spending cuts or emergency borrowing under punitive conditions. On the other side of the debate, economists such as Michael Saunders counter that Britain today is structurally different from the 1970s. The country has a floating exchange rate, an independent central bank, and access to deep global capital markets. Unlike the fixed rate regime of 1976, which left the government trapped as sterling collapsed, modern Britain can allow its currency to adjust naturally without resorting to IMF intervention. In their view, Reeves's challenge is not an imminent solvency crisis, but a credibility test. Can she persuade investors that her mix of high spending and high taxation will eventually produce growth rather than stagnation? There's also a political side to this debate. Critics say Rachel Reeves is spending too much and risking a new wave of inflation. Supporters, however, believe she is doing what's necessary after years of cuts, arguing that Britain's hospitals, schools, and infrastructure urgently need rebuilding. In their view, the real threat isn't debt. It's letting the economy stagnate for so long that recovery becomes impossible. The reality probably sits somewhere in the middle. Britain's finances are fragile enough to require caution, but not yet in immediate danger of collapse. The next year will be critical. If the economy fails to grow and borrowing costs stay high, the bond markets could start dictating government policy, just as the IMF once did. For now, economists agree on one thing. Britain's room for mistakes is shrinking fast. While economists argue over Britain's financial stability, the political consequences of the country's fragile economy are already being felt. The Labour government's approach to spending and taxation has not only divided economists, it has also emboldened the opposition. Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, believes that the very same economic pressures worrying financial analysts could soon bring down the government. The party argues that rising borrowing costs, persistent inflation, and a lack of fiscal discipline are steadily eroding public confidence in Labour's leadership, creating the conditions for an early election. Nigel Farage has openly told Reform UK activists and MPs to prepare for a 2027 general election, declaring that Labour's handling of the economy will force Sir Keir Starmer into an early poll. Reform's leadership sees striking parallels between the current situation and the political turmoil that followed Britain's last major financial crisis in the 1970s. Back then, a collapsing economy paved the way for a dramatic change in government. Farage is betting that history could repeat itself. Reform UK's strategy is to present itself as the voice of economic realism, a movement warning that Labour's tax and spend policies will drive Britain deeper into debt and weaken investor confidence. The party argues that high public spending and rising taxes will stifle business growth, push inflation higher, and squeeze ordinary families already struggling with the cost of living. In their view, it's not just economists who are losing faith, it's the British public too. Kemi Badenoch has attempted to position the Conservative Party as the party of economic responsibility, drawing a sharp contrast with Labour's spending plans. In recent speeches and interviews, she has repeatedly stressed that Britain must live within its means, warning that constant borrowing and excessive public spending will only pass the burden onto future generations. Badenoch argues that while investment in key services is necessary, it must be underpinned by fiscal discipline and long-term planning rather than short-term political gains. Her message is simple. The government cannot spend its way out of every problem. There is a general consensus that Britain's economic position is in an extremely weak state. Debt is near record highs, growth is stagnant, and the cost of borrowing continues to rise. Even among economists who disagree on the likelihood of an IMF bailout, few deny that the nation's fiscal health is fragile and its room for manoeuvre dangerously narrow. The parallels to the 1970s, when soaring inflation, political instability and collapsing confidence forced Britain to seek international help, are becoming harder to ignore. Rachel Reeves's policies have divided opinion. To some, she is rebuilding a broken economy. To others, she is repeating the mistakes of the past. What's clear is that the choices made in the next year will determine whether Britain restores market confidence or drifts towards another crisis of credibility. So far, her decisions have not strengthened the UK's position, Borrowing remains high, growth is sluggish, and investor confidence is fragile. The warnings from figures like Jagdeep Chadha and Andrew Sentence might seem alarmist to some, but they reflect a deep unease about where the country is heading. So the question remains, is Britain truly heading towards an IMF-style bailout, or can it still pull back from the brink? That may depend less on politics and more on whether the government has the courage to face the economic reality before it's too late. Let us know in the comments below. Do you think Britain is on the verge of another IMF crisis, or can it still turn things around?